All right, so this, your reading notes that I gave you last time were chapter 12, section 1. This is the next section. It's the beginning part of the next section on the intellectual and artistic development in the Renaissance. This first slide talks about patents. So we have discussed in class about wanting to understand more how a culture can be inventive. And we talked about the United States being where a lot of inventions are created and wondering why the United States is that way, more so than other countries like North Korea or China, especially countries that outperform us in school. I mean, they score well on tests, a lot better than we do, but we invent more than any other country. And so part of that invention culture has to do with patents. And a patent gives you the legal right over an invention for a set period of time. So that if today I invent a time machine and I patent it, then that means that only I can have it produced usually for 7 years. That gives me an exclusive right to manufacture it for 7 years. So even if the technology gets out there, like people say, oh, well, that's really easy. I had no idea that paper clips and Mountain Dew could be developed into a time machine. Even with that, by law, if somebody else starts producing it and uses my idea, I can take them to court, I can sue them, and I can essentially take all the money that they've made off of the development. So this talks about where that comes from, right? The first recorded patent for an industrial invention was granted in 1421. And Filippo Brunelleschi is the one that was given that monopoly on the manufacture of a barge with a hoisting gear used to transport marble. Okay, so when we were talking about the notes for the Renaissance, the introduction to the Renaissance, I talked about, people who would lift marble for sculpting and stuff like that. So he actually comes up with a barge, which is a kind of boat, with a gear on it so that you can lift large pieces of marble, move them by river, and then transport the marble back down somewhere else. So he has that patent. So he is, in many ways, a well-rounded Renaissance man, just like Da Vinci. Right? We know Brunelleschi as an artist, but he was also an inventor. And, of course, now we know he was the first one to be granted an industrial patent. Okay, so there's a lot on this slide. We're just going to go kind of point by point. Right? So the first line there, we've talked about the word secular before. We said that secular is the opposite of spiritual, so secular is worldly. So secularism is the practice of being worldly. Right? It's a way that you behave. And then we also talked about, with the introduction to the Renaissance, about the rise of the individual. I mentioned that this is the beginning of the rock star era. So right there, secularism and individualism in the Renaissance was most evident in what we're looking at today. Right? We can examine the art, we can look at paintings, and we can infer a specific amount of information from that. But most of what we're going to be talking about with secularism and individualism in the Renaissance comes in what we're going to look at today. Right? So of all the intellectual movements, all the new ideas that people were having and discussing and debating, the primary one, the one that still exists today, is that of humanism. So that is definitely a term you need to have in your notes. You want to make sure that you have the word humanism in there, and then we're going to talk about what that means. We'll talk about humanism as a concept, as an intellectual movement. You might have heard the word used if someone claims to be a humanist. Right? Something that you might hear in the news or in a general conversation about people who might identify themselves as a humanist. Right? So what is that? So humanism ties closely to the Renaissance because we said that the Renaissance is the rebirth of the Greek and Roman philosophy. So humanism then is based on classic written works, like from the Greeks and the Romans. They studied subjects that we call humanities. Right? Humanities would be the study of humanism as an ideology or as a philosophy. And some of those humanities are poetry, philosophy, and history. Mostly when we talk about the humanities, we're talking about history, we're talking about social studies. Right? We use the term social studies in academia, in school, to talk about things like economics and government and world geography and history, world history, U.S. history, that all of those are social studies. They are also part of the humanities, as well as poetry and philosophy. We don't really teach those as separate courses here. World history and, to some extent, U.S. history is your philosophy course. We don't really have another philosophy-based course outside of in our curriculum. You might get some of your philosophy from your English class, but I think a lot more of the philosophy comes from history class. And then poetry is just a component of your English literature class. All right, so the next part is about Petrarch. So if there is an individual that we can say led to the development of humanism, that is Petrarch. Right? And he is one of our rock stars of the Renaissance. That's why he only has one name, right? Just like Raphael and Donatello, and we could say Leonardo, even though we usually say Leonardo da Vinci, we act like da Vinci is his last name, even though it isn't. What does da Vinci signify? Why do we call him Leonardo da Vinci, if da Vinci isn't his last name? Ooh, where he's from. Good. So he is from the town of Vinci. Leonardo of Vinci. Right? It's like 5 names. I don't know what it is because we never call him that. We always call him Leonardo, but specifically Leonardo from the town of Vinci. So Petrarch there then is responsible for really kickstarting humanism. He started this, the text says movement. It was a rising interest in finding lost manuscripts. Okay. So manuscripts that were either lost in churches or in monasteries or even in some cases in really old houses. Documents that were written in Latin, books that had been lost. So if we said, we've got, let me plan this out. Okay. So it would be like finding an old book and then saying, what can those old books tell us that we don't know? But you have to find them first. And so these lost manuscripts could be anywhere. And since they weren't going to be just out on somebody's table, it meant that people kind of went out and tried to find in churches and in monasteries and in people's houses, specifically like castles, places where a document might have been put and then forgotten. And then to go through it and say, what can we learn about those people, kind of like a mystery, a detective story. What can we learn from those books that we find? Okay, so here are some 2 kind of old books. This one is not the oldest, I don't think. This is a soldier's manual from, when was this one printed? 1941. So this would have been a book that a soldier in World War II carried, and learned how to be a soldier. So this is an old version. This is a newer version. It's a newer version of this. This is a newer version. All right. So this is a modern day soldier's manual, right? the IET, Soldier's Handbook. So this is all the stuff that soldiers need to know today. So if you were a soldier and then you found this would tell you what it was like, what soldiers needed to know. So in here, it tells you how not to get shot, and how to throw a grenade, and how to clean an M16A2 or A4. In here, it tells you, how to signal for rescue. It does in here too, but this is more for if you're signaling from rescue on an island in the Pacific, where this is global. Okay? So this is how much soldiers need to know today. This is how much soldiers needed to know in World War II. Okay? And then this is a soldier's manual that was printed in 1911. So this would have been a soldier's manual for a soldier in World War I. It was a soldier's manual for a soldier in World War I. It was actually carried. All three of these actually have been carried. So by going back and finding old books, then Petrarch, through humanism, re-sparked an idea of why it's important to know what they thought back when. Right? And just showing you this as an example of volume, how more complex it is to be a soldier today than it was in World War II or in World War I. Right? Which is why we can draw out a supposition as to why it's not just enough to have a high school diploma to go into the military. They used to accept people who didn't graduate from high school because all you had to know was this, or maybe this. But that's not true anymore. Now, if you don't graduate from high school, even the military looks kind of askance at you and wants to know why, and maybe has you go get your GED or something before you can go in the military. Because to be just a regular infantry soldier, you have to know this. Okay? So that's where humanism comes from. So they emphasized the intellectual life was solitary. They were kind of like modern monks. Right? They were philosophy monks, humanist monks. They rejected family and community engagement. Humanists in the early 1400s took interest in civic life. They believed that the humanities and humanists should serve the state. And then, because of that, many humanists served as secretaries to the Pope and to princes and to kings and all that. So their goal was to help people. And because of that, they eliminated family obligations and focused on just helping the state, helping the government, helping the church as a government, not as a religion. They weren't proselytizing. They were trying to make it run better. And you made it run better by understanding why people behaved the way they did. That's what you learned as a humanist. That's what we learned from history. Why people do what they do, and why they do it. Okay? All right, so in your notes, I would like for you to take just a minute and answer this question. So we just talked about this new study of the classics and the humanities. How is that going to impact, how is that going to change what many people do? Not everybody, most people, a majority of people. How is a new study of classics and the humanities, how is it going to impact their lives? So take a couple minutes and put your answer into your notes, please.